Hello, everybody, and welcome to ASTP and FDA's joint listening session, kicking off the comment period to our latest USCDI Plus data set. This one is focused on improving clinical trials for acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, and you may also hear us refer to this project as USCDI Plus Respiratory Illness. My name is Matt Ron. I'm the director of the Standards Division in the Office of Standards Certification Analysis at the Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy at HHS. So thank you for joining us. The session is going to be recorded for those who could not attend today. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But a little bit of background on us is since 2009, with the passage of the HITECH Act, ASTP has been charged with creating a nationwide health information technology infrastructure that allows for the electronic use and exchange of information and promotes better patient care, a more effective marketplace, and a greater competition. ASTP is building on this infrastructure by adopting and developing national standards with industry and working to ensure that technical innovations are readily available by patients and providers, and leveraging our Health IT certification program to build the foundation for interoperable Health IT. My colleague Ms. Turi is going to talk a little bit more about USCDI Plus. So rather than taking anything away from her presentation, I'll say that we're excited for this opportunity to collaborate with our colleagues at FDA to drive innovation in the clinical trial space for ARDS. I'll now turn it over to Liz to talk about USCDI and USCDI Plus, then to Dr. Hilary Marston, the Chief Medical Officer at FDA, and then Dr. Ali Abbasi, a Senior Policy Advisor also at FDA. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Liz. So thank you all.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning. My name is Liz Turi. I'm the branch chief of care coordination and collaboration within the Standards Division. And I also lead USCDI Plus program management. To do a little bit of level setting, I wanted to give a little bit of background on USCDI and what it is and how it relates to USCDI Plus. So USCDI, it is the United States Core Data for Interoperability. It sets the floor for exchange between health IT systems and is integrated into our certification program. It sets a consistent baseline of harmonized data elements that can be broadly reused across use cases, including those outside of patient care and patient access. We do update it annually. We just released version 5 this past summer, and version 3 was incorporated into our most recent rule, HTI 1, earlier this year. Set to be required by all certified health IT systems by January 1st, 2026, which expands access to a number of data elements. However, over the years, what we've seen, next slide, please, is that USCDI, while broadly applicable, makes it difficult for very specific use cases to understand where they sit within the world of USCDI Plus, or within the world of USCDI. We also have noticed that there are gaps between what USCDI accounts for and what specific use cases need. Just entire classes of data elements that are not included in USCDI because they are not broadly applicable. So what we ended up doing is creating an initiative called USCDI Plus that looks at use case specific data needs, where we can work together in a collaborative approach between other federal partners and industry partners to identify where those gaps are, identify what data elements do fit within USCDI but need to be more granular as they approach implementation. And we apply the concepts around USCDI, those processes for submission and harmonization within USCDI Plus so that we're using repeatable processes. So we look to collaborate intensely with our federal partners, our industry partners. We have a public feedback period for an identified data element list. We really work towards understanding what the impact of those data elements are. And we look to leverage programs and authorities across HHS in order to drive adoption. We have divided USCDI Plus into 5 different domains. However, we do have use cases that fall outside of an established domain, and respiratory illness is one of those. And we will see more on that towards the end of this presentation. Next slide. Here, I just wanted to provide a little bit of a visualization of what we're looking to achieve. This is just, again, I mentioned one aspect of USCDI Plus is to look at gaps in another domain. We look at, we consider that an obvious gap is, for example, genomics. There's no place for genomics within USCDI. And so that's a topic of discussion as we look forward to that domain's Plus initiative. Likewise, again, we look to identify the scope of value sets that may be required in order to meet a need that we need to define as we move from data element lists to implementation. So, for example, I like to use medications as an example. Medications are very broadly applicable, but specific use cases may only want a subset of medications in order to meet the need of the use case, reporting requirements, et cetera. Next slide, please. The other thing to note about USCDI Plus is because we are focused on harmonization and understanding, the impact of overlapping needs, we make it really explicit around, where those data elements are available across other domains and where we're having the same conversation. So we use what you'll see a little bit later in the tool that we use to navigate USCDI Plus. We can actually see where specific data elements with the same definition are leveraged across domains and use cases. Here's a good example of where, encounter diagnosis is seen across 4 different domains and 4 different use cases within those domains. Next slide. All right, with that, I hope that gives you enough of a background. If you have questions about it, please feel free to provide any questions or discussion, and we'll address them towards the end. With that, I will hand it over to Dr. Hilary Marston.
Thanks so much for that, and thanks for that information. All right, next slide. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about the need for USCDI Plus for ARDS. This slide will probably give some folks PTSD. It's showing the hospitalizations in 2020 when, as we all know, our healthcare system was just crushed with patients in dire straits. We had no approved treatments for COVID-19, huge unmet need for those treatments, and we were stretched thin. Clinicians, we all remember the days of putting more than one patient on a ventilator, for example. Our clinical research system in some ways really shined in this moment. We were able to stand up randomized controlled trials, very quickly get quality data, whether it was the active trial suite or ACT. We, however, didn't make enough use of the rich information that was coming out of these different sources, which is something that we really want to highlight today and something we'd like to solve for the future. Next slide. And this was actually recognized as a gap in the data strategy, which was put out last year. So use case B was preparedness and incident response, where we recognize the need to create a foundational infrastructure for this type of preparedness research, specifically highlighting the potential role that USCDI Plus could play in enabling this. Next slide. Just a little bit on ARDS itself. This says COVID, but it could be in many other conditions as well. So in the case of COVID, this was multifactorial, right? The Viral infection set things up, but then we had super infection, other relating to general care in the ICU, for example, transfusion-associated lung injury, fluid overload. All of these things can contribute to the multifactorial and complicated picture that ARDS presents. But the ultimate result is that you are unable to properly oxygenate the blood, and unfortunately results in high mortality. Next slide. So here we see how that plays out in numbers. This is more general, not just COVID, but frequently seen in the ICU and particularly in patients on ventilators. And as you can see, as the severity of the ARDS goes up, the mortality just skyrockets. Next slide. So what can we do about this with USCDI Plus? We believe that there is a role that research can play here, some really rich information that could be coming out of these care settings, but we need to set things up properly in advance so that that can happen. So just some definitions before we dive in further, because these terms get used interchangeably. Real-world data and real-world evidence. So real-world data are just the data, right? Things that are extracted from regular patient health status, long predated the EHR, right? It could be just medications that are given to a patient, anything that's happening in the specific clinical care setting. Real-world evidence, though, is actually extracting evidence, as in causal inference, potentially, from those real-world data. And real-world data, as I mentioned, nothing new, but really the universe of it and the potential accessibility of it has just exploded with the electronic health record. Next slide. So what we have then is the potential to get everything from laboratories, provider observations, vital signs, device observations, medications, all of those things become accessible. However, the ability to use those for clinical research in particular depends on the quality of the data. These data are designed not for research, right? They're designed for clinical care. They're also designed for several secondary uses, whether it's public health, as in just how many cases that we're seeing, for example, of COVID across the nation, quality improvement measures locally, billing critically, it is certainly designed for those purposes, and research. Unfortunately, research can sometimes be an afterthought, which is something that we'd like to take on here. Next slide. So the current state of how the EHR is getting into research databases is unfortunately very manual. So we call it the swivel chair problem, where some research assistants will be hired to take a look at things in the electronic health record and copy them into the clinical research database. It's slow, it's error prone, it is obviously not the way that we would like to do business. In the future state, what we are hoping for is that this becomes automated, that it can happen in real time, that we can fix those issues with accuracy. So USCDI Plus, once it's implemented with FHIR and installed at clinical sites, can ensure that the data elements are both somewhat uniform, easy to extract, and can go directly into those clinical research databases. The hope being that that will directly enable clinical research. Next slide. Of course, in order to do this, the FDA can't do it on its own, NIH can't do it on its own, et cetera, et cetera. We need all of the individuals shown on this slide, all of the individual organizations to work in concert. I think the collaboration that we've had on this area so far has been a great example of that, and we look forward to driving this further. All right, Ali, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Thanks for giving the overview to ARDS and the need for UCDI Plus. So I'll give a brief overview now. My name is Ali Abbasi. I'm a senior policy advisor at the FDA, and I've been partnering with ASTP on developing this really important program. So I'll give a brief overview now over the program that we've developed, and then I'll turn it over to our colleagues at ASTP to review the next steps in some detail. So the purpose for this project was to create a USCDI Plus data element list and FHIR implementations for ARDS. And specifically, we want to focus on research for interventions to treat severe ARDS, so typically treated in the ICU or in a higher level of care settings. We also want to make sure that whatever data is generated through these pathways could, in theory, meet FDA's requirements when it is used in a fit-for-purpose study design. We're focusing here on treatments in the inpatient setting, so not as much focused on outpatient treatments or preventive therapies like vaccines. These are no doubt important, but just to keep the scope for this initial project manageable, we decided to focus on severe ARDS, and I'll explain in a second why. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is the high-level timeline for this work. We started earlier this year with some stakeholder engagement and developed a draft list of data element. We then performed a structured set of interviews with 9 stakeholders, people who are in the health IT community and people who are running clinical trials in ARDS, and got some feedback from them on that data element list. And that the result of that process is what you'll see in the draft data element list posted on the ASTP website. We're now undergoing a period of public comment and subsequently, based on those comments, a revision of the data element list. And then next year, once the list is finalized, we'll move on to the implementation guide creation and pilot projects. Next slide, please. So we have collaborated with federal partners. The partners that have been most closely involved in this project have been ASTP, CDC, FDA, and NIH, so formed, and CMS, sorry, formed sort of the core group. And on this slide are a few relevant programs that these agencies have that we've discussed these data standards with. And the goal for all of USCDI Plus, as Liz already alluded to, is to make sure that we are not reinventing the wheel. It's really important that whatever we do is harmonized with the needs of federal partners and the needs of the ecosystem, the health IT ecosystem more broadly. And so by collaborating with these federal partners, we are striving to make sure that these data elements will be useful for our federal partners and also will avoid duplicating work that's already been done. And I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the collaboration that we've had from these federal partners, and I see some of them on the call today. Next slide, please. So discussions have been held with several groups of people. I've mentioned some of them already. So we have spoken to representatives from professional societies, to investigators. We've spoken to clinicians who care for patients with ARDS, and we've spoken to experts in health IT, especially specifically those with expertise in data capture. And we've spoken to some folks who are running registries. And some of the themes that emerge from these conversations really highlight the importance of USCDI Plus for ARDS. One thing that frequently came up is the amount of data that's generated in the ICU is really a challenge for clinical trials because of the sheer volume of data values that need to be collected. But many have also highlighted that that data is already collected in a structured way. When clinicians round in the ICU, typically they review data in structured format, such as in flow sheet format, which is actually a perfect target for automated extraction because the data is already highly structured. We also heard that there is relatively low penetration at this point of FHIR resources for research. And as Hillary mentioned, a lot of clinical investigations still use manual data capture and data transfer. In terms of the specific data elements, we'll see the complete list shortly. But a couple of high-level themes are that ventilator settings are a huge data gap. Obviously, the ventilator creates a lot of data, and there's also a lot of inputs in terms of the settings. And so those are frequently used in investigations, and many investigations have compared different ventilator strategies even to each other. And there isn't really a good way for researchers to extract those data from the EHR. There are some workarounds that are institution specific, but that is not a solution that really supports multi-site investigations. Other themes that have come up is the fact that medication administration is sometimes difficult to observe. The orders are typically easier, but sometimes there can be challenges identifying when a medication has been administered. And then a final challenge is that many clinical investigations need to capture critical events in a structured format. It needs to be a way to assess whether or not, for example, a pulmonary embolism has occurred, whether or not the patient is having pneumothorax. The current way that these data are recorded in the EHR is a real challenge for investigators because most often these are documented in free text notes. They sometimes have the information that's needed to adjudicate whether that event truly occurred as defined by the trial protocol, but often they don't. And so I think an additional area for advances that we could make with this program is to help improve the capture of these events in the EHR. If you go to the next slide. And I think, yeah, that's it for me. I'll turn it over to our colleagues at ASTP to talk about the draft data element list.
Thank you. So with all of that being said, and thank you to our presenters for sharing a more in-depth view of what we're looking to achieve with USCDI plus respiratory illness. I want to walk you through our USCDI plus platform because the data element list for respiratory illness focusing on ARDS is live, and we are looking for public feedback between now and January 17th. As you'll see here, we have our URL at uscdiplus.healthit.gov. Note that in order to comment or to access downloads of the data element list, you will need to create an account and log in. If you have any history or experience in working with our USCDI commenting system or ISA or SVAP, please note that this is a different system and you will need to create a separate account in order to access or in order to comment on the data element list. You can view them all you want without an account, but to comment or interact, you will need an account. Next slide. So once you go into the system, you will see that there is a box that says other use cases. If you click on that, you will see the other use cases that are available in that area. You will see respiratory illness as the first one currently, only one currently. And next slide. If you click in there, then you will see the full list of data elements. We currently have 83 elements listed under respiratory illness. These do share, they are shared. Some of them are available currently in USCDI. Some of them are shared across other domains. As noted earlier, in order to see those relationships, you would need to click directly into a data element to see where else that data element is available. One thing to note, you may comment on the use case, a data element, etc. You can comment at any level within the platform. All you'll need to do is click on that comments tab right next to details. Next slide. So in the details, you'll be able to see all of the information that we have available on this data element, whether or not it's in USCDI. If it is in USCDI, what level or version it may be in. Again, you can click on relationships, and then lastly, you can click on comments. Next slide. Next slide. Within comments, there are a couple of required elements. First one is the comment itself, and the other one is comment period. We always like to know if somebody is commenting as part of a comment period or not. The options are you either need to fill this drop down with whatever open comment period is available, or select no comment period. We do accept comments all year long, but during a comment period, we're able to focus the dispositioning and the response. So when you click on the box for comment period, you'll see a drop-down list of any and all available comment periods that are currently running. Currently today, there are actually 3 comment periods running, only one of which is for respiratory illness, and that is indicated here. You will select that comment period in order for it to become active. Once you enter in your comment, then you may click submit. Next slide. So what we did not do in this presentation is delineate all of the data elements that we are proposing. However, we did summarize which data classes we are proposing. So a couple of them are existing within USCDI. So vital signs, medications, and laboratories should be pretty familiar if you're familiar with USCDI. But then we created new data classes that aren't previously represented. And so we are looking for information on those. Respiratory support, enrollment, treatment outcome, really focused on clinical trials, adverse events, and intake and output. Next slide, please. So as you are thinking through your review and any comments that you may want to provide, we have put together some framing questions for just to think about. We would love to hear, responses to these, but also we want to hear any responses that you have to our proposed data element list. We are looking for both feasibility and appropriateness for the use case, but we're also looking to understand the impact of implementation. Are these data classes and elements detailed enough to support the collection? Are they clear enough? Are there any barriers to collecting or exchanging these data elements? Are there workflow impacts that we need to understand? Is, from the EHR technology community, are there any considerations that we need to think about? Next slide. All right. So with that, I will hand back to Dr. Abbasi for facilitating discussion and questions, and open it. You can put your comments in chat. You can put them in the Q&A section, or you can unmute and share.
Thanks, Liz. So keep an eye on the chat for any questions. One thing that might be of interest is the question of pilots for implementation. So I just wanted to address that real quick. So at the moment, we haven't identified, we've identified several opportunities for potentially testing these data standards in the form of clinical trials that are either ongoing or planned. We haven't yet selected the pilot project, and we also haven't yet begun the process of writing the FHIR implementation guides. So if there are investigations that you feel would be a good fit for testing and implementing these standards, we'd love to hear about them, and you can let us know either in the public comments or directly via email. This is so first question from the chat from Mitra is whether there are data elements that in this USCDI plus ARDS that might be in common with the IRAE, the immune-related adverse event use case as part of the USCDI plus cancer effort. I think that's a really good question. I think there's certainly some overlap in the goals of these different use cases. Both of them are seeking to determine whether an event has occurred from the EHR data and make it easier for clinicians to report that event so that it can be passed on to investigators and eventually, submitted by a sponsor to the regulators. The approach that's being taken in these different initiatives is a little bit different. The USCDI plus ARDS is really focused on recording a limited number of specific events that commonly occur in ARDS and that are commonly recorded in ARDS trials. So these are things like myocardial infarction, pulmonary embolism, and pneumothorax. And the number is pretty small. There's about 10 events that really every trial in ARDS probably would want to record. And so the idea for this effort is to create a structured data field for those events. For the IRAE use case, the goal is a little different in the sense it's more meant to be a tool for signal detection. It's not meant to, record specifically whether an event or not has occurred. It's focused on detecting a potential event and then passing that on to sponsor investigators so they can adjudicate that event. And it's also, that use case is also more focused on the regulatory reporting, so making sure that those can be reported to FDA in a post-market setting. So all that being said, I think the goals are somewhat similar, although not identical, but the specific data elements are a little bit different because here we're focused specifically on this limited set of 10 data elements, whereas the other use case is more focused on creating generalizable tools that can record any kind of adverse event, because immune-related adverse event can occur really in any organ system. Any other questions? Liz and Ashley, how can folks reach out if there are additional questions after the call? I know that the public comments is a good way, but perfect. There's the email. So maybe we'll see that screen so people can reach out if there's any additional questions.
And just in case you're not looking at the screen, we are looking for comments by January 17th, late at night Eastern time, and that we anticipate publishing a final version in mid-2025. You can always contact us via our program email address at uscdi.plus@hhs.gov. So I know that if there are no other comments or questions today, that's okay. Again, feel free to send us email. We definitely look forward to your input and questions and discussion as we move forward. But if there are none, then I guess we can give some time back to your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.